This is the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project, series of video interviews with the people who have impacted Nebraska broadcasting for decades. Today we're at the studios of UNO Television in Omaha. I'm Neil Nelkin for the NBA. Being involved in television almost from the beginning here in Omaha gives Lee Terry a perspective that really few of us have had. He was a witness to the early technologies as they evolved into today's TV. He knew many of the people who actually started out in Omaha television and built it into what it is today. He's seen the practice of journalism firsthand as it changed from what it was to what it is, and maybe even a look at what it will be in the future. He remembers things like the Camel News Caravan with John Cameron Swayze as the evening network news. We want to welcome to our history project today former KETV newscaster Lee Terry. Lee, welcome.
Boy, you really made me sound old. You know, people
Seasoned.
would come up and say, "You're the old newscaster." I'd say, "No, I'm the former newscaster."
Big difference.
Yes.
Big difference. Let's start off at the beginning. Back in 1945, when you moved from Los Angeles, right?
I was originated in Los Angeles, and I came to Omaha from Colorado Springs. My dad was a contractor, and he was in charge of building Camp Carson at that time during the war, and so we moved there just as the war was ending. Came here in early 1945
For a job.
No, he was. I was just a kid at that time.
But he came for a job?
He was the president. He was a vice president of the construction company, and the home office was here, and so we ended up in Omaha.
You ended up in Omaha, and you ended up in Omaha Television. You were pretty early on in Omaha Television. How'd that happen?
Well, I was very fortunate. I was going to Creighton, and they had a priest there by the name of Father Williams, Roswell Williams. And he came to me and he says that he heard that WOW is looking for a photographer. And I wasn't much of a photographer in those days. I had taken a course in photography. And but I went, and Lyle DeMoss, that's an old name in television, was the program manager. And I went in, and Lyle DeMoss hired me as a photographer. And they had one of the people working there as a photographer was Bob Moakler. And Moakler took me out in the parking lot and showed me how to take movies. I had never taken movies. I'd taken a lot of still film. But so my first episode, ironically, my first film story was with a camera where I was the operator of the camera, was a Creighton parade downtown. My first story that I covered, and Bob Moakler went with me as the cameraman, was when Eisenhower was in town for the 1952 election. So that got me started in politics. I really enjoyed it. As a matter of fact, I was often asked, why do you cover all this sound-on films with politicians and all that type of stuff? You never seem to want to go to murders and fires. And I said, well, murders and fires affect a few people for a part of the time. Politics affects all of the people all of the time. And I really thought it was very important that we get the political news to the people.
And of course, having somebody like General Eisenhower in town, that was big news.
Oh, that was big news. Yeah, it was a tremendous 1952, as you know, he was elected president.
That's what I've heard.
That was good. That was the rumor was out there.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting story for me, because being my first episode into journalism, to get to interview the next president of the United States.
That was WOW Television, Channel 6, and it was a network affiliate station at that time?
Well, I probably would have a little trouble remembering, because WW was at one time CBS, and then I think went to NBC. And then KM changed and went from NBC to CBS. Or vice versa. But I think at that time in sometime in the mid-50s, 53 or so about there, they made that change going from CBS to NBC. So then they became the NBC station here.
You were out carrying around big, heavy, clunky, black and white sound camera equipment, right?
Gee, you know, these people, back in those days, the studio cameras were that big, and now they're this big. And we had Bolexes and Bell and Howells that were the small cameras. And the Oricon Pro, if we want to do any sound, the Oricon Pro 600, which was about that big, and the sound box was about that big, and it took about 3 people to operate it, but nobody wanted to pay for 3 people going out on the story. So one person had to do the camera work, the audio work, and sometimes step in front of the camera and do a report there, because that equipment, nothing like what you got today.
And then, of course, you had to drag it all back to the station and process the film and edit the film.
And back in those days, it was a wing and a prayer type thing of whether the processor, which was probably 15 feet long, and it went through so many chemicals, and if you weren't lucky, it would break, and so you'd end up with half of the film got through and half didn't. It was pretty rough in those days. But the biggest problem is you're trying to get a quick news story on, and you got to process the film, and then you got to edit the film, and then get it onto the projector. And so it wasn't like today. They've got it pretty easy today. And ironically, I'm doing it with 9 people. Back in those days, in the 50s and 60s, we were working with 9 people in putting on a newscast. And today, I think these newsrooms have something like 55 people that are doing the news.
Back then, you told me the evening news, the late evening news, that you used to be the newscaster for, and I'm specifically not using the word anchorman because I know you dislike that word.
Well, I don't dislike it, but the anchorman was really when you got into the more modern news type of thing. We couldn't use stand-up reporters like they do now. They go out on the scene, and the anchor man is the guy that anchors the situation by throwing the news items to other people. And with me, it was just you were the newscaster. You started out, and there were no stand-up reporters or anything. Later on, when tape did come in, we managed to get a few network type things that we'd put on tape, but otherwise everything we did was on film, and being live was almost an impossibility at that time.
And an adventure.
Oh, yes, yes.
You told me about the evening news being a 5-minute newscast, and you told me why. Let's go back to John Cameron Swayze for just a minute. That was the newscast. We went on at 5 to 5:15, and then John Cameron Swayze came on with a network from 5:15 to 5:30. That was our big newscast. The 10 o'clock newscast, which is here in Omaha, the big newscast, and has been for years. The situation with us is, we had I think it was exactly 5 minutes, because Gene Thomas, who was the vice president and general manager, and Ken James, who was the program manager, insisted that since they paid millions of dollars for a movie, that they got the movie on early because they were competing with WOW and their movie Masterpiece. And so they wanted to get a head start on getting the movie going before WOW got their movie going, so that they wanted at least 25 minutes into our movie, then nobody would leave it to go over to the other one. So I started 5 minutes, and then I would work into a 7-minute newscast, and then finally into a 10-minute newscast. And so they called me up into the office and said, enough of this stealing, we want to get that movie on as quickly as possible. The heck with
so
the news.
No more of that. Well, then I would 13 minutes and 14 minutes. And finally, when I was coming close to 15 minutes worth of news, they called me up and told me I was going to be fired if I took any more time. So finally, I think 2 or 3 times I was taken up to the home office and told, cease and desist. The newscast is 10 or 15 minutes long and no longer. And I kept stealing time, so finally they gave up and said, okay, let's do a half hour. But boy, with that half hour, then we got to get the movie going. And so that's how we developed into a half hour, 10 o'clock news. Now they're hour. Of course, with the operation of where you can go live with things and so quick with tape. And for instance, if some tragedy happened, they interview the people and they listen. You get the tears and the grief and all that. We weren't able to do that in those days. We weren't able to get that type of emotion. We went in and told a story that happened, and that was it. And it was 15, 20 minutes, seconds long. And now they can go to an hour newscast because so much of it is interview.
And so much of it is live from the scene.
Yes, yes.
Which you couldn't do.
Very definitely. There was no say. As a matter of fact, we were very proud of ourselves because we started doing live audio. Whenever we'd go out on an accident or something like that, they'd call in. And it didn't last too long. Our audio was breaking up. It was bad audio. So we couldn't even do that well live in those days.
It's changed a lot. Now everything is live and everything is on satellite and microwave, and it seems pretty easy to do. But
well, I'm not too sure. You know, it took this television station a while to figure out how to use live television. As I used to kid around, I said, I think they had Arnold Peterson planting tomatoes in every county live so that they could say, this is live television. They came to me when I was the election commissioner and said they wanted to do a live at 5. This was WOW. And I said, they said they wanted to come in and talk to me about what we're doing with the election. I said, well, we don't have any election. All we're doing is taking voter registration, and that isn't very exciting. Well, we've got to have something live at 5, so we came in and did a live at 5 interview about nothing.
But they had a live interview?
Yes, but they had the live interview.
You worked with some pretty exciting people over the years, but back in the day at WOW, people like Steve Murphy, Ray Clark, people like that.
Yeah, Ray Clark was the news. As a matter of fact, I was really responsible for putting his whole 10 o'clock newscast together in those days, writing it and getting the whole thing set up for Ray. And who, I will say that I'm the second best newscaster because Ray Clark by far he was great. He was really great. Now, Steve Murphy was not the newscaster. Jim McGaffin was the newscaster in those days. And then Steve after Jim left. So
Steve became the longtime news director at Channel 6 for many years.
Yes, he did.
You took a break from Omaha television and took your experience out to Denver.
Yes.
What did you find out there?
Well, I found a lousy news situation. As a matter of fact, one day I was rushing out of the studio, and this was when I was working for KOA, and the news director said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, they got a bank hold up down the street, and I'm going to go cover it." And he said, "Oh, forget about it. We have bank hold ups all the time here." So I had to put the camera away, and we didn't cover the thing. As a matter of fact, here in Omaha, we probably would average at least somewhere between 7 and 10 videos a night. There we were averaging maybe 2. So I didn't last too long there. As a matter of fact, I left the KOA and went to KBTV, and I became the newscaster at KETV. That was my first episode of being a prime newscaster at noon. And all it was rip and read. There was no newsroom at all. They didn't cover any news. As a matter of fact, to make it even more difficult, the AP wire machine that I got my news from was in the ladies' room, and one day I went to get it, and the door was locked. And I didn't think I was going to be able to do the newscast. I finally got the person to open the door so we could do, but it was on a program called Denver Today, and I did a 5-minute rip and read type thing of the news. So I got the idea that this wasn't a good news town, and it's changed now. Now it's just superb. They do it. But I came back to Omaha in 1959 and went to work immediately with KETV.
They'd been on the air about 6 or 7 years at that time. They'd built a reputation.
Well, they went on. They went on the air at 57, and I started with them in 59.
Okay,
so there
2
was
years.
only 2 years difference.
Yeah, and at that time, the television station KETV was owned by the Omaha World Herald,
World
right?
Herald, yes.
And I asked you earlier, was there a lot of sharing of resources between
as a matter of fact,
the World Herald newsroom and the KETV newsroom?
As a matter of fact, there was no situation where the World Herald and KETV worked together, really. As a matter of fact, I asked for a picture of Amelia Earhart because I didn't have one, and the World Herald wouldn't even give me that. So that's the way it goes, and that's probably good. But there was never any situation. Well, I take that back. When the John Coleman case, you remember where Dworak and Gugas and everybody got in trouble over this. There was a building of apartments and all this type stuff, and the World Herald broke that story of John Coleman, and I read the World Herald story word for word on the air. That was as close as we ever came to working with the World Herald.
Did you get called on it? Was it okay?
Oh yeah, it was fine.
Let's go back and talk about John Coleman. He was a pretty
instrumental
guy.
There's two different John
Different
Coleman.
John Coleman. Let's
John
talk about
Coleman,
the weather
the real
guy.
estate man, was not John Coleman, the weather man.
Let's go back and talk about John Coleman, the weather guy, who really built his reputation here in Omaha, didn't he?
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, we brought John Coleman in, and he was a humorous weatherman. Everything was a comedy situation. As a matter of fact, I used to give a final story was as light or as funny as possible. And because John Coleman was so funny, I quit doing anything funny in the news because I thought we were probably more entertainment than we were news. But John Coleman, I can remember one time, he had a fence built in front of his weather set, and he sat on that singing, "Don't Fence Me In." And I swear to God that he didn't even give the temperature at the time, and the people loved it. And
it was an act.
But that brought KETV, who was suffering, going from a 5-minute news to a half-hour news, suffering in the ratings. And when John Coleman came in with his comedy and the weather, KETV went to an absolute #1.
Back in those days, you didn't have all the computers. You didn't have all the graphics machines. You had little cutouts you stuck on a magnetic board for the weather, and people loved it.
Well, it was the only play in town. You know, that's the way it had to be done. As a matter of fact, KETV was the first station to go all color. Now, both KM and WOW at the time were studio color, but we went to studio color and then to color film. And the one thing was like we had an AP fax machine of photos, and that was all in black and white. So I got some chalk, and my reporters would throw in we knew trees were green and lawn was green, and the things that we would do that just to get a tint of color so that we were an all-color station at that time.
You also told me that you kind of got that idea from a future congressman?
Oh, yeah. I was babysitting Lee at the time.
Your son.
And so in order to keep him entertained, I gave him a whole bunch of fax photos and some Crayolas, and he was coloring them. And I looked at that and said, why don't we do that? I mean, there are certain things that you know that are going to be that color, and you can use it, and it was a hint of color more than full color. And so his coloring those photos made me think that that's the way we should go, and that made us fully an all-color station.
And then when you went to color news film, was that a big adjustment from black and white to color?
Not so much a big adjustment, except in that you know that the audience is going to enjoy it more. But we were fortunate enough to have a three-story fire alarm that the day that we were going into color, and to go out and shoot this brilliant fire in color. It really was really something to behold, and that was the first all-color station, and that was probably in the early '60s.
And then John Coleman went on to New York City eventually with Good Morning America.
He went to Chicago. Yeah, well, that's right. I forgot all about that. He did do but I think that was done out of Chicago.
It was done out of Chicago. It was AM America at the time. They hadn't become Good Morning America yet, but he did the weather segments on AM America. Then they developed Good Morning America, and he went on to found the Weather Channel.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, he did found the Weather Channel, and then Ted Turner bought him out of it. And at one time, you know, John Coleman came back to Omaha and worked for KFAB.
I remember.
And at that time, I think he was trying to buy a TV station in Grand Island, and somebody else got it, and so he went back to Chicago, and then he ended up in San Diego.
I think you're right.
Doing. But he was people loved him. I mean, he made really the big difference in our ratings until finally, I almost adjacent. I started editorials, and we were the only station that was doing editorials during the newscast, and this was back in the time when Spiro Agnew was upset with the nadering nabobs of negativism.
Right.
And
for those who don't remember, Agnew was vice president.
And particularly criticizing people who'd editorialized in the news.
You.
And well, I wasn't editorializing. What I was doing was I would do a news story, and then I would stop and say, let me make this observation. So I was doing observations, and so then I would do the editorial. Well, then Spiro Agnew came up with this criticizing people for claiming to be doing news, and yet they were editorializing in the news. And although we made it very, very specifically noted that this was different than the news by being an observation, Ken James, who was the Vice President General Manager at that time, came to me and said, we'll continue doing these, but we will label them editorials, and we will also say that they're supported and by KETV's management. And so we started doing editorials, and that kept us number one.
And stirred up a lot of controversy in the community at times.
Well, and it did, but you know, the FCC at that time demanded that you give the other people the right to, and so if somebody got too upset, we had them either write an editorial, and then we gave that editorial. So,
back in those days, there were very, very few women, particularly in newsrooms. It was a boys' club, wasn't it?
Very definitely, and also it was all white. And so KETV, we hired 2 women, and I think 3 or 4 black reporters. Harold Dow was one of our, Harold Dow went on to 48 Hour Mystery and started doing a network type
was with CBS
thing.
for many years.
So he was good. He jumped from here, and then he went to news in California, and then finally ended up doing the network out of New York with 48 Hour Mystery. And he was just absolutely great. I was very, very fortunate with the women and with the black reporters that I had, that we had the best team. Even though we only had 9 people at that time, we had one of the best teams going. So.
And today, women fill almost every job. In fact, the general manager, the 3rd general manager that's a woman at KETV, and women in the newsroom up and down, minorities, having equal opportunities. It's a totally different world today.
And I tell everybody that I've been replaced by 3 women and 5 meteorologists. And that you know, back in my days, there was no such thing as a meteorologist. We didn't have any weather training. The weather person, with some exceptions, was just an announcer. Now, early on, as I recall, Ed Stapowicz, who was the weather chief here, the federal chief, head
The
of
Weather
weather,
Bureau.
also did the weather on one of the stations. I can't remember whether it was WOW. And then Chuck Thomas also had background for WOW, and he was a meteorologist. But after that, it was just, all kinds of gimmickry. They had weather according to Hoyle. The guy's name was Hoyle that did it. And KMTV would move fronts a little bit by hand, and they call it weather in motion. We did, and then we brought on John Coleman with our fun stuff, and so the weather had a lot of emphasis there of trying to attract people. And probably we're the only place in the whole United States that absolutely led with the weather. That we didn't lead with news in those days. They led with the weather, with the idea that people in Omaha want to know what the weather is going to be for sure.
And if you hooked them with the weather, they'd stay with you for the rest of the newscast.
Yeah.
That's the plan, anyway.
No, that's true. That's true.
Over the years, what would you say either the biggest story you've been involved with, or maybe even the most important story you've covered over the years?
Well, you know, the biggest story I ever had never got on the air. As a matter of fact, I had a friend of mine who brought me the plans for putting weapons, rockets, missiles in cornfields in Iowa and Nebraska. And I had the plans for it and everything else, and I went to the news director. I said, boy, we got to put this on. They're putting missiles in cornfields in Nebraska out near Meade. And the news director at that time told me, he says, well, just on something as flimsy as the plans for the thing, we can't put that on. Who would ever believe that you're going to have missiles in cornfield? He said, go out to Meade, the Army base out there, and talk to them. And so I did, let them know that I knew about that, and they denied it, absolutely denied it. The next day, I wake up to the morning newscast on radio, network. They broke that story, so I never got to break. That was my biggest news story and biggest disappointment.
You also remember when Interstate 80 was being built across this part of the country, and in Iowa, a specific exit that people may not be aware of.
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, they had one of these missiles in a cornfield at Beebeetown, just in that area. And I've been asked several times, why do they have an interstate exit at a town like Beebeetown? And that was it. That was a military operation.
And most of those were controlled out of Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, and people don't realize that those silos are still there today.
Yeah, yeah.
Some of them are being made into homes.
Yeah.
You interviewed an awful lot of people over the years.
I guess that's true, too, yeah.
You've interviewed a lot of people over the years, people that have come through, people who have stopped in for one reason or another. Who would you say is the biggest name you've ever been one-on-one with?
Well, oh boy, you know, I've interviewed every president and the Kennedy and Johnson and Reagan and Eisenhower. But one of the most interesting interviews I ever had was with Edmund Hillary. He was just exciting to talk about his episodes in climbing mountains.
Yeah, explain who Edmund Hillary
what have
was.
you there. Yeah, well, he was, yeah, the Mount Everest, he and I can't remember the name of the...
Norgay. Surging Norgay?
Something
was the Sherpa guide?
Yeah, yeah.
Anybody out there?
Anyhow, that was probably one of the more interesting. I remember in the hotel room interviewing Jerry Lewis. He was one of the, you know, because he was always on, always funny. And another one that I really enjoyed that was always on was Roy Clark, the country singer and guitar. But my most involved use of interview was with politicians. Like I said, politics is so important that it affects all of the people all of the time, and it's very important. I think, for television to cover politics. There's been times when I thought stations were ignoring politics because it was politics. But if you omit what's going on in politics, you're hurting the people as far as.
So you go back and you've had some pretty close relationships with some politicians who have been pretty powerful over the years. Names like Roman Ruska, Carl Curtis, two Nebraska senators, who I'm assuming you knew pretty well.
Oh, these were, I considered them friends, and the unfortunate thing is, even as a newscaster, I was having to defend Curtis and Ruska for their ultra-conservatism. You know, everybody would say how bad they were and all that. They were so bad they kept electing them over and over and over again, and they were all in there for over 20-some years.
And always got reelected with tremendous percentages.
That's right.
They represented their people well. But you got along great with them.
Well, Roman Ruska, well, and Carl Curtis, they were both very, very, very close friends, and so.
What about mayors of Omaha over the years? You've known them pretty well.
Well, yes. I got in trouble with Al Sorensen. Sorensen didn't like the media. He liked to keep everything secret, and they moved into the old Elks Club building after they tore down the old city hall, and so Sorensen had his office in there, and I went on the air one day with one of my editorials, and I said that being the Elks Club, that building used to house a semi-secret organization, and still does, with City Hall. And Sorensen got upset with me on that type of thing. But Sorensen had an idea that if he wanted something without alarming people and all that he would have the meeting and he would bar the media from going in. And so, you know, you got people like Leahy and these were great, and Zorinsky. These were great people that really catered to the media. And you know, one of the people that really catered to the media more than anything else was Carl Curtis, or not Carl Curtis, but General LeMay.
Oh, Curtis LeMay.
Yeah, Curtis LeMay,
who was the commander at SAC.
If you wanted something in an interview about military and the Air Force and all that, all you had to do was call up Kurt LeMay, and he was willing to do it. He was a part of the Omaha Chamber of Commerce, really, and so that built up a great relationship between our city and the Offutt Air Force Base. It was Curtis LeMay that really made the difference.
And it's been that way ever since. You've seen a lot going on. What do you see as the future for the media? You know, it's been pretty controversial from the political aspect of the infighting and the partisan politics, and also the way the media has evolved to where it is today. You're an observer, you see it. What's your opinion of what's going on today, and do you think there's a hope for the future here?
Well, you know, I watch a lot of this stuff, and I agree with Donald Trump that there's a lot of fake news going in there. Somehow or another, the media, and I don't know how they're going to do it, has got to reinvent themselves, so to go back to where they used to be, because people really had faith that they were getting the right story and the stories they needed to know and what have you. And I don't think the people feel that way today. I have coffee with a bunch of guys, and they all talk bad about the media. Nobody trusts the media. How they're going to reinvent themselves, I don't know. But I really can't answer that. I wish I knew what the future was going to be like in that area. But there used to be a time when you would almost get in trouble. Going even back to John Cameron Swayze, whatever, or any one of the newscasters, what they said was gospel. Now the people really make fun of it.
Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America.
Yeah, very much so, very much so.
They referred to him as Uncle Walter.
Even though he was very considered to be on the liberal side, and there were a lot of good Republican conservatives that didn't think that Walter Cronkite was necessarily a good voice. But you've asked a question there that probably we should get about 5 or 6 people together and discuss how that could be done, because I sure don't know what.
We do know one thing: you can't go back again. The old days are the old days, and you can't go back to those days again. Too much has changed.
The media has got to go back to a situation of where the people trust them, really. The thing that I worried about in this area of trust is, since you have a half-hour worth of news, actually less than 20 minutes worth of news with commercial and sports and weather and all that type of stuff, you have very little amount of news. And particularly today, there's a tremendous amount of news to be had. So you've got to do something to make the people know that they're getting the full story, and I don't know how you do that on television. You see, look at what the World Herald is doing. My golly, it's like they're writing War and Peace over again every Sunday. Every story is 2 and 3 pages long. The thing that I worried about more than anything else was that by omission, because there's certain stories you can't get on because of time elements, and there's certain things about story you don't want to make too long. And back in those days, a 15 or 20-second story was a big, we really prided ourselves in television in getting 19 or 20 stories in this few-minute period. And so that's going to require that you're going to omit something that probably should be there. And I always encourage people, read the newspaper and read other news magazines, because you aren't going to get it all in television news, all of the information that you should be getting.
Now that people are getting most of their information online, they're not reading the newspapers. Newspapers are dying across the country because the younger audience doesn't go to the newspaper anymore. They get it online.
Well, everything is instant in this society we live on. So, as a matter of fact, I worry about that even with television. Going back to what I was saying, that when something tragic happens, you spend a lot of time getting people's tears and grief and remorse and all this type of stuff. That maybe by doing that, you're eliminating stories that you should get on, because you still in television have a time element to play with, which you don't have to worry about with the printed matter. And I think it's a shame if we're losing the newspaper readership.
Maybe it can be reversed. Lee, it's been a pleasure. You bring some tremendous history to our project, and we appreciate it so very much. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure. I'm glad you invited me.
Our subject today: legendary, and I'll use the word legendary, Omaha television pioneer Lee Terry. This has been a production of UNO Television and the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project.